The Vanishing Hiker. In 2017, a woman named Claire decided to go on a solo hike in the remote forests of Washington state. She was an experienced hiker, familiar with the trails and well prepared with a map, a fully charged phone, and enough supplies for a day trip. Before heading out, she texted her sister the trail she'd be on and promised to check in when she got back to her car. The trail was unusually quiet that day, eerily so. Claire didn't encounter a single other hiker. She noticed strange things as she walked: a child's shoe lying in the middle of the path, claw marks high up on the trees, and, at one point, the distant sound of footsteps that didn't match her own. She convinced herself it was her imagination or maybe a deer moving through the brush. But the hair on the back of her neck stood up. Midway through the hike, Claire came across an old, abandoned cabin that wasn't marked on her map. Curious, she decided to take a closer look. The door was ajar, creaking in the wind, and the faint smell of rot wafted from within. Inside, it was dark, the light barely filtering through the grime-covered windows. The air was thick with mildew and decay. The walls were scratched with strange symbols, deep, jagged lines that looked almost like a language she couldn't understand. In the far corner, she noticed a small pile of bones, fragile, brittle, like they'd been there for years. Suddenly, she heard the sound of heavy breathing behind her. It was deep, labored, and unmistakably human. She whipped around, but the room was empty. Her heart raced as she scanned the cabin, but there was no one. The breathing stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to settle over her like a thick fog. Panicking, she grabbed her phone to call for help, but there was no signal. The screen flickered, then went black. The hairs on her arms stood on end as a cold chill crept through the cabin. Something was terribly wrong. The unsettling feeling grew stronger, as though the walls themselves were closing in. She could hear something now, a faint scratching noise coming from the walls. It was as if something was trying to claw its way out. Without thinking, Claire bolted for the door. Her breath came in sharp gasps as she sprinted back toward the trail, but with each step, she felt as though something was following her, just out of sight. Every now and then, she'd catch a glimpse of a shadow darting between the trees. Her pulse thundered in her ears, and the sound of footsteps seemed to grow louder and closer, though when she turned, there was no one there. The trees loomed like silent watchers, their twisted branches reaching out as though to grab her. When Claire finally reached her car, she locked the doors in a panic and sped off without looking back. Her mind raced, replaying the events over and over, trying to make sense of what had happened. She stopped for gas a few miles down the road, trembling with adrenaline. Later that night, her sister received a chilling text from Claire's number: "Found the cabin. You should come." Her sister quickly called Claire, but the phone went straight to voicemail. She tried again and again, growing more frantic with each call. Finally, she texted, asking Claire where she was, if everything was okay. No response. The next morning, Claire's sister drove to the forest, determined to find her. She arrived at the trailhead, but there was no sign of Claire's car. The path was empty. She called the local authorities, and a search party was organized. They combed the area for hours, but they found nothing: no footprints, no signs of struggle, no traces of Claire. That evening, Claire's sister went through her phone, trying to piece together what had happened. She found a strange, unmarked message, a draft sent from Claire's phone just after the text had been sent. It was blank, with only one word typed at the top: run. As Claire's sister combed through her phone, she felt a cold shiver down her spine. The draft message, *run*, was sent just before Claire's last text, and it was dated hours before the authorities found any trace of her. The message didn't make sense. The phone had been locked in Claire's backpack when she reached the gas station, yet this draft had been created after she was already gone. The authorities investigated the cabin, but it had vanished. The trailhead was checked again, with no signs of Claire's presence, no footprints leading to her from the spot. The search parties scoured the area for weeks but found nothing. Claire's sister, now desperate, began to dig into the history of the area. She learned of a chilling local legend, the story of an old, long-abandoned settlement that had once been nestled deep within the woods, rumored to be a site of strange rituals and disappearances. It was said that anyone who ventured too close to the land at dusk would hear voices on the wind, sobbing, pleading, or sometimes, calling out their names. Some believed the spirits of those who had vanished long ago still roamed the forests, looking for the next person to take. With no clear answers from the authorities and unable to shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong, Claire's sister decided to visit the forest herself. She gathered a few friends, and they set off toward the trail where Claire had last been. The air was thick with mist as they walked, each step heavier than the last, as though the ground itself resisted their movement. When they reached the cabin's location, they found nothing but a clearing. The trees surrounding it were unnervingly silent. No sounds of birds or rustling leaves, just the eerie quiet that Claire had felt on that day. Her sister's heart pounded in her chest as they made their way through the woods, hoping to find even a shred of evidence. But then, they stumbled upon something unexpected, a weathered journal, half buried in the earth near the remains of a fire pit. The pages were brittle, but the handwriting inside was unmistakable. It was Claire's. The last entry read, "They're here. I can hear them. I think it's too late." Suddenly, a voice broke the silence, soft and distant at first, then louder, closer, and unmistakable. "Run!" Asterisk. Her sister froze, and the others with her looked around frantically, but the voice seemed to come from everywhere, the air vibrating with its urgency. It echoed through the trees. There was no sign of Claire, but it felt as if she was still out there, somewhere, calling to them. In that moment, the mist thickened, the trees seemed to close in, and a shadow darted between them, moving far too quickly to be human. Her sister felt a pull, a cold, suffocating presence, just beyond her reach. She turned to run, but the ground seemed to give way beneath her feet, and she was yanked forward, as though the forest itself had grabbed her. The last thing she remembered before everything went black was the faint whisper of Claire's voice in the wind, "Don't let them find you." Weeks passed, and the search continued, but there was no sign of Claire's sister, nor of her friends. The authorities claimed there had been no new evidence, just an abandoned trail with no trace of them. But locals whispered about a new shadow in the woods, someone wandering the trails late at night, calling out in whispers. Every so often, a lone hiker would disappear, only to be replaced by another who would leave behind nothing but an eerie sense of déjà vu. Months passed, and the mysterious disappearances continued to haunt the region. The authorities had no answers, but the stories lingered, spreading through the small town at the edge of the forest. Claire's sister was never found, nor were any of her companions. The woods seemed to have claimed them all, swallowing them without a trace, leaving only whispers and old memories behind. One stormy night, a lone hiker, Michael, passed through the same forest where Claire and her sister had last been. He had heard the stories, of course. Who hadn't? But like most people, he dismissed them as nothing more than local legend, until he found himself lost in the deepening fog. The path had become unfamiliar, and the trees seemed to press closer together, narrowing his way. The cold mist clung to him, seeping into his bones as he pressed on. And then, just as the sun dipped behind the horizon, he stumbled upon the same cabin, shrouded in darkness, its door ajar. The faint smell of mildew lingered in the air, and a sense of dread washed over him. Michael hesitated, but then, driven by a strange compulsion, stepped inside. The moment he did, the door creaked shut behind him, and the temperature seemed to drop by several degrees. The room was dark, save for the faint moonlight filtering through the grime-covered windows. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and in the corner, the remains of bones were scattered, just as Claire had described. The silence was oppressive, suffocating. But then, Michael heard it, the soft sound of breathing, labored and ragged, coming from the far end of the room. He turned quickly, his heart racing, but no one was there. His breath caught in his throat as a cold hand brushed against his shoulder. Panicked, he tried to leave, but the door wouldn't open. The shadows in the room began to shift, forming shapes that seemed to be watching him, waiting. Then, the whispers started. At first, they were faint, almost inaudible, but they grew louder, becoming clearer. "Run," the voice said, and Michael's blood ran cold. It was the same voice Claire's sister had heard, the same voice that had warned them. He spun around, and in the dim light, he saw her, Claire, or what was left of her. Her eyes were wide with fear, her hair matted with dirt, her clothes torn as though she had been wandering the woods for years. She was kneeling on the floor, her hands trembling as she scribbled something frantically in the dirt. Michael stumbled backward, his heart hammering in his chest. But as he moved, the shadows seemed to move with him, closing in on him. There was no way out. He was trapped. Before he could react, the figures in the room began to converge on him, shapeless, twisted forms of lost souls, their faces half masked in shadow, their mouths open in silent screams. They reached for him, their cold hands gripping his arms, pulling him toward the center of the room. And then, just as suddenly, the room fell silent. The shadows retreated, and the figures were gone. The door creaked open, and Michael, now pale and trembling, bolted from the cabin, not daring to look back. He ran until his legs gave out, but when he reached the edge of the forest, the fog had cleared, and the sun was rising. He was alone. No sign of Claire, no trace of the horrors he'd just witnessed. It wasn't until later that he realized the truth: he wasn't the first to escape. No, Claire wasn't the only one who had been there. They were all still there, waiting for someone new to join them. The cabin was not just a place in the woods. It was a prison, a threshold to a realm beyond, where the lost souls wandered, trapped for eternity. And Michael, he never spoke of that night. But every year, on the same date, he could feel the pull of the forest. The whispers would begin again, calling him back. End. The horror is never truly gone, only waiting. Subscribe to our channel for more such true stories.